Imagine you're sitting in a comfortable room reading a book or watching a show. Everything feels normal, safe. But what if I told you that this comfort, this sense of normalcy, is actually a conspiracy? Not a conspiracy by governments or secret societies, but a conspiracy by your own mind against itself. This is the disturbing idea that Thomas Ligotti explores in his philosophical work, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. Ligotti isn't your typical philosopher. He's a horror writer who has decided to turn his dark lens on the biggest horror of all, human consciousness itself. Most philosophers throughout history have tried to find meaning in life. They've searched for purpose, for happiness, for the good life. But Ligotti asks a different question entirely. What if consciousness itself is the problem? What if being aware, being alive, being human is actually a terrible mistake? Before you dismiss this as just pessimistic nonsense, consider this. Have you ever wondered why humans are the only species that needs to convince itself that life is worth living? Birds don't read self-help books. Dogs don't go to therapy to find their purpose. Trees don't have existential crises. Only humans do. Ligotti's work isn't easy to read. It's not meant to make you feel good. In fact, it's designed to make you uncomfortable, to question everything you've been taught to believe about the value of human existence. He's part of a philosophical tradition that most people don't want to acknowledge exists. This tradition is called philosophical pessimism, and it's been around for thousands of years, though it's rarely taught in schools or discussed in polite company. Why? Because it challenges the most fundamental assumption of human society, that life is good, that existence is valuable, that consciousness is a gift. Throughout this exploration, we'll journey through Ligotti's dark vision. We'll meet the philosophers who influenced him, examine the biological and psychological mechanisms that keep us trapped in existence, and confront the possibility that everything we've been told about the meaning of life might be wrong. Let's start by understanding what Ligotti means by conspiracy. He's not talking about a group of people plotting in secret rooms. Instead, he's describing something far more insidious, the way our own minds deceive us into continuing to exist, into finding reasons to keep going, into believing that consciousness is something fallible rather than a curse. Think about it this way. Your brain is constantly working to keep you alive. It produces chemicals that make you feel good when you eat. When you connect with others, when you accomplish goals, it creates narratives that give your life meaning. It filters out information that might make you question whether existence is worthwhile. This isn't a conscious choice. Your brain does this automatically, because brains that didn't do this didn't survive evolution's brutal selection process. We are the descendants of the organisms whose brains were best at lying to themselves, at creating illusions of meaning and purpose. Ligotti calls this the conspiracy against the human race, because it's a conspiracy that humans perpetrate against themselves. We are both the conspirators and the victims. We create elaborate systems of meaning, purpose, and value to distract ourselves from the fundamental horror of being conscious beings trapped in a meaningless universe. The great trick, according to Ligotti, is that this conspiracy is so successful that most people never even notice it. They go through life believing that their thoughts, feelings, and experiences are real and meaningful, never realizing that they're all just products of a biological machine trying desperately to keep itself running. Why does this matter? Because if Ligotti is right, then everything we think we know about the good life, about happiness, about meaning and purpose is built on a foundation of self-deception. And once you see this deception clearly, you can't unsee it. This is what Ligotti calls the nightmare of consciousness. Unlike physical nightmares that you wake up from, this is a nightmare you wake up into. The moment you become truly aware of your own awareness, you realize that consciousness itself is the trap. Most people, when confronted with these ideas, react with immediate rejection. They say it's too negative, too dark, too depressing. But Ligotti would argue that this reaction is itself part of the conspiracy. Your mind is protecting itself from a truth too terrible to bear. Throughout human history, there have always been individuals who saw through the conspiracy, who recognize consciousness for what it really is. They have been called pessimists, nihilists, or worse. They've been dismissed, marginalized, or ignored. But they've also been remarkably consistent in their observations across different cultures and time periods. Ligotti stands in this tradition, but he brings something new to it, a horror writer's eye for the truly terrifying implications of these ideas. He doesn't just tell you that life is meaningless, he shows you the nightmare lurking beneath every moment of conscious existence. In the sections that follow, we'll explore how this nightmare unfolds. We'll look at the biological mechanisms that trap us in consciousness, the psychological tricks that keep us believing in meaning, and the philosophical arguments that support this dark vision. We'll also examine why most people refuse to see it, and what it might mean if we finally acknowledge the truth. This isn't a journey for the faint of heart. Ligotti offers no comfort, no solution, no hope. He simply holds up a mirror to consciousness itself and asks us to look closely at what we see. What we find there might be the most disturbing truth of all, that we are creatures designed by evolution to be perpetually deceived about the nature of our own existence. Are you ready to question everything? To examine the foundations of human experience and find them built on nothing? To confront the possibility that consciousness is not a gift but a curse? Then let's begin our descent into Thomas Ligotti's philosophical nightmare. The horror of being born. Let's start with a question that most people never seriously consider. Would it have been better if you had never been born? Not whether you should die now, but whether coming into existence in the first place was a good thing. Your immediate reaction is probably to say yes. Of course, being born is good. You exist, you have experiences, you have people you love and things you enjoy, but Ligotti asks us to examine this assumption more carefully. Is existence really better than non-existence? This question has a name in philosophy, the problem of coming into being. It was explored deeply by a Romanian philosopher named Emil Cioran, who greatly influenced Ligotti's thinking. Cioran wrote extensively about what he called the trouble with being born, and his insights are central to understanding Ligotti's pessimism. Think about it rationally for a moment. Before you existed, you had no needs, no desires, no pain, no suffering. You weren't missing out on anything because there was no you to miss out. Non-existence is a state of perfect peace, of absolute absence of suffering. But the moment you came into being, you became vulnerable. Vulnerable to pain, to disappointment, to fear, to loss, to aging, to disease, to death. You became a creature with needs that must constantly be met. Food, water, shelter, warmth, connection. You became subject to the tyranny of consciousness. Most people respond to this by pointing out the good things in life: joy, love, beauty, pleasure, achievement. But Ligotti would argue that these good things only exist to counterbalance the bad. You only experience pleasure because you first experience pain or discomfort. You only feel joy because you felt sadness. Happiness is just the temporary absence of suffering. Moreover, all the good things in life are fleeting and uncertain, while suffering is guaranteed. Everyone who is born will experience pain. Everyone will face loss. Everyone will decline and die. These are not possibilities. They are certainties. The good things in life are just intermissions between periods of suffering. This leads to what philosophers call the asymmetry argument, developed by the contemporary philosopher David Benatar. The argument goes like this: if you don't exist, you don't experience pain, which is good. You also don't experience pleasure, but that's not bad because there's no one there to be deprived of it. But if you do exist, you will definitely experience pain, which is bad. You might also experience pleasure, which is good, but that pleasure is necessary only because you exist and have needs. If you didn't exist, you wouldn't need the pleasure to counterbalance the pain. From this perspective, being born is always a harm. You go from a state where suffering is impossible to a state where suffering is inevitable. You gain nothing that you were lacking before, because before there was no you to lack anything. Ligotti takes this idea even further. He argues that consciousness itself is a form of suffering. Just being aware, just having experiences, just being a self-conscious being in a world you never asked to be part of, is a burden. Every moment of consciousness is a moment of potential suffering. Consider your daily experience. Even in moments when nothing particularly bad is happening, there's a background hum of discomfort, of anxiety, of vague dissatisfaction. You're always wanting something, worrying about something, trying to avoid something. This is the baseline state of consciousness, a state of lack, of incompleteness, of striving. We've been taught to see this striving as positive, as what gives life meaning and purpose. We're told to set goals, to improve ourselves, to achieve things. But Ligotti asks, why is this necessary? Why do we need to constantly strive if existence is supposed to be good? The answer, he suggests, is that existence isn't good. It's a problem that requires constant management. We create meaning and purpose not because they are inherently valuable, but because without them, the horror of mere existence becomes unbearable. Think about what happens when people stop creating meaning for themselves, when they lose their sense of purpose, when they can't find reasons to keep going. We call this depression, and we treat it as an illness. But what if depression is actually clarity? What if it's seeing existence as it really is, without the comforting illusions? Ligotti suggests that what we call mental health is actually a state of successful self-deception. Healthy people are those who are good at lying to themselves, at creating illusions of meaning and value. Depressed people are those for whom the conspiracy has temporarily failed. This is why the question, "Why was I born?" is so disturbing. There is no good answer. You weren't born for any particular reason. Your parents didn't consider whether bringing you into existence would be good for you. They made that decision based on their own desires and circumstances. You had no say in the matter. And now here you are, thrust into existence without your consent, expected to find meaning and purpose, told that life is a gift. But a gift implies something you wanted or would benefit from. Existence is more like a burden that was placed on you without asking whether you wanted to carry it. The horror of being born, according to Ligotti, is that it's an irreversible harm. Once you exist, you can't go back to non-existence without dying, which brings its own suffering and fear. You're trapped in consciousness, forced to keep going, forced to find reasons to continue, even though you never asked for any of it in the first place. This might sound unbearably dark, but Ligotti isn't trying to make you feel better. He's trying to wake you up to a truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, that being born is the original catastrophe, the first and greatest harm that befalls every human being. Most philosophical and religious traditions try to redeem existence, to find meaning in suffering, to justify consciousness. But Ligotti refuses this consolation. He insists that we look directly at the horror of being born and acknowledge it for what it is, an imposition of consciousness on a being that never needed or wanted it. Now let's talk about how we got into this mess. How did consciousness, this burden that Ligotti sees as a curse, come to exist in the first place? The answer lies in evolution, but not in the inspiring story of progress that we're usually told. Instead, Ligotti sees evolution as a blind, mindless process that accidentally created the worst possible outcome. Beings aware enough to suffer, but trapped in a biological imperative to continue existing. Evolution is often presented as a wonderful thing, a creative force that produced the diversity and complexity of life. We're told to marvel at how perfectly organisms are adapted to their environments, how intricate and sophisticated biological systems are. But this is a romanticized view that ignores what evolution actually is. Evolution has no goals, no intentions, no care for the well-being of any creature. It's simply a process where organisms that reproduce more successfully become more common. That's it. There's no design, no purpose, no meaning behind it. It's just blind variation and selection playing out over millions of years. From this perspective, consciousness is an accident. It emerged not because it makes life better or more meaningful, but because it happened to help certain organisms survive and reproduce more effectively. Being aware of your surroundings, being able to think and plan, being able to remember and learn, these traits helped our ancestors avoid predators, find food, and pass on their genes. But evolution doesn't care about suffering. It doesn't care if consciousness is pleasant or painful. All that matters is whether it helps an organism reproduce. And here's where things get truly dark. Consciousness that includes suffering might actually be more evolutionarily advantageous than consciousness without it. Think about it. Pain is a powerful motivator. Fear keeps you alive. Anxiety makes you vigilant. Dissatisfaction drives you to seek better circumstances. All of these forms of suffering serve evolutionary purposes. They keep the organism moving, striving, reproducing. A perfectly content organism might not bother to do much of anything. So evolution, in its blind workings, created beings that are constitutionally dissatisfied. We're designed to always want more, to never be fully content, to constantly worry about potential threats. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's exactly what evolution would produce in a conscious creature. Ligotti sees this as evolution's cruel joke. It created consciousness sophisticated enough to recognize suffering, to be aware of our own mortality, to question the meaning of existence. But it also hardwired us with an overpowering instinct to continue living and reproducing. We're caught in a trap, aware enough to see how terrible the trap is, but biologically driven to remain in it. This is what Ligotti calls malignantly useless. Human consciousness is sophisticated enough to recognize its own predicament, but not sophisticated enough to do anything about it. We can see that existence is suffering, but we can't stop existing without invoking even more suffering through the fear of death. Consider the complexity of the human brain. It's the most complex structure we know of in the universe, capable of abstract thought, self-reflection, creativity, and sophisticated language. But what does it spend most of its time doing? Worrying about survival, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, the same basic drives that motivate much simpler organisms. All that complexity, all that consciousness, and we're still slaves to evolutionary imperatives that don't care about our well-being. We've been given the ability to question existence, but not the ability to escape it. We can see the cage, but we can't leave it. Ligotti draws on the work of evolutionary biologists and neuroscientists to show how our brains are designed to deceive us. The same processes that create our sense of self, our feeling that life has meaning, our conviction that existence is worthwhile, these are all products of biological systems that evolved to keep us alive and reproducing, not to reveal truth to us. Your brain produces hormones and neurotransmitters that make you feel good when you do things that help your genes survive. Eating, having sex, bonding with others, achieving status. It makes you feel bad when you do things that threaten survival. Going hungry, being rejected, losing status, facing danger. None of this has anything to do with truth or meaning. It's all just biological machinery churning away, producing experiences that motivate behavior. The feeling that life has meaning is just another evolutionary adaptation, not a reflection of any actual meaning in the universe. This is why Ligotti is so dismissive of attempts to find meaning in evolution itself. Some people say that the process of evolution gives life meaning, or that we should find purpose in contributing to humanity's evolutionary future. But this is just another form of self-deception. Evolution doesn't care about you or humanity's future. It's not going anywhere in particular. There's no ultimate goal or purpose to it. It's just a process that happens, producing organisms that are good at surviving and reproducing. Whether those organisms suffer or flourish, whether they experience their existence as meaningful or horrible, is completely irrelevant to the process. Moreover, evolution has no endgame. Some people imagine humanity evolving into something better, transcending our current limitations, but there's no reason to think evolution would produce anything better than what we have now. It might just as easily produce something worse, or nothing at all if humans go extinct. The disturbing truth is that we are products of a process that has no concern for our well-being. We exist because our ancestors successfully reproduced, not because existence is good or valuable. Our consciousness, with all its capacity for suffering, exists because it helped those ancestors survive, not because it makes life worth living. Ligotti sees humans as trapped in what he calls the malignantly useless paradox. We're sophisticated enough to recognize the horror of our condition, but we're still driven by biological imperatives that don't care about that horror. We can't stop being conscious, and we can't stop being driven to survive and reproduce. This is evolution's cruelest achievement, creating beings that can suffer from knowing they suffer, that can be tormented by awareness of their own mortality, that can question the meaning of existence but find no satisfying answers. And all of this sophistication, all this consciousness, exists only to serve the mindless imperative of genetic replication. Let's talk about what's really controlling you. Most people believe they're in charge of their own minds, making conscious decisions based on rational thought and personal values. But neuroscience and psychology tell a very different story, one that Ligotti uses to devastating effect in his philosophical work. You are not the author of your thoughts. You are not the originator of your desires. You are not even the decision-maker you think you are. Instead, you're more like a puppet, and the strings are being pulled by biological and psychological mechanisms that operate completely outside your conscious awareness. This isn't mysticism or speculation. This is what modern science shows us. Brain imaging studies reveal that decisions are made by unconscious processes before you become aware of having made them. Your conscious experience of choosing something is actually just your brain reporting a decision that was already made. Think about the last decision you made. Maybe you decided to read this right now. You probably feel like you consciously chose to do so, weighing your options and deciding this was a good use of your time. But did you really choose? Or did unconscious processes in your brain, based on factors you're not even aware of, produce an urge to read this, and then your conscious mind created a narrative about having made a choice. Ligotti uses these insights to argue that the self we think we are, the conscious, choosing, rational self, is largely an illusion. What we call I is really just a story that the brain tells itself, a narrative structure imposed on a chaotic stream of unconscious processes. This should be terrifying. It means that you're not really in control of your life in any meaningful sense. The thoughts that pop into your head, the feelings you experience, the decisions you make, they're all produced by processes you didn't choose and can't directly control. You didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose your genes or your early environment. You didn't choose the biological and psychological mechanisms that now control your behavior. Where exactly is the you in all of this? What part of your experience is genuinely yours rather than just the product of forces beyond your control? Ligotti calls this being a puppet of matter. We're physical organisms subject to physical laws. Every thought, every feeling, every experience is produced by electrochemical processes in your brain. You don't control these processes, they control you. Or rather, they're you, and the conscious self you think you are is just one of their products. This understanding completely undermines conventional notions of free will, responsibility, and personal autonomy. If you're not really in control of your thoughts and actions, then what does it mean to say you chose them? What does it mean to take credit for your achievements or accept blame for your failures? Most people find these ideas uncomfortable and resist them strongly. We're deeply invested in the idea that we're autonomous agents with free will. Our entire social structure is built on this assumption. We hold people responsible for their actions because we believe they freely chose them. But Ligotti argues that this belief in free will is part of the conspiracy. It's another lie we tell ourselves to make existence more bearable. If we admitted that we're puppets, that we have no real control, that we're just biological machines playing out predetermined patterns, it would undermine all our notions of meaning and purpose. Consider your goals and ambitions. You probably believe you chose them, that they reflect your values and desires, but where did those values come from? Where did those desires originate? If you trace them back far enough, you find they were all produced by factors outside your control: your genes, your upbringing, your culture, random experiences that shaped your brain in particular ways. Even your attempts to change yourself are controlled by the mechanisms you didn't choose. If you decide to improve yourself, to become a better person, where did that decision come from? It arose from brain processes you didn't initiate. You're like a robot programmed to think it's making its own choices. This is what Ligotti means when he talks about humans being contradictory beings. We experience ourselves as conscious, choosing agents, but we're actually determined by physical processes we don't control. We feel free, but we're not. We think we're authors of our own lives, but we're really just characters in a story written by evolution and circumstance. The brain does incredible work to maintain the illusion of a unified, controlling self. It edits out inconsistencies, fills in gaps in awareness, creates coherent narratives out of disconnected experiences. It makes you feel like there's a you in there running the show, when really there's just a collection of processes doing what they do. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga calls one part of this system the interpreter, a function of the brain that constantly generates explanations for your behavior, creating the illusion that you consciously chose to do what you did. Even when experimenters manipulate people into doing things through unconscious priming, the interpreter creates a plausible story about why they chose to do it. You're not just controlled by unconscious processes, you're also constantly deceived by your brain into thinking you're in control. It's a conspiracy within a conspiracy, your brain controlling your behavior and then convincing you that you chose that behavior freely. This has profound implications for how we think about consciousness. If consciousness isn't really in control, what is it for? Ligotti suggests that consciousness might be an evolutionary accident, a byproduct of brain complexity that serves no real function. We're aware of our experiences, but that awareness doesn't actually do anything. Or worse, maybe consciousness exists only to suffer. Perhaps being aware of our lack of control is itself a form of torment. We're sophisticated enough to realize we're puppets, but we're still forced to go through the motions, still driven by biological imperatives we can't escape. Think about your daily struggles. You try to resist urges, to control your emotions, to make better choices, but you're fighting against your own brain, against systems that are far more powerful than your conscious will. And even the desire to improve yourself, to gain more control is itself just another product of those unconscious systems. This is what makes the puppet analogy so disturbing. A normal puppet is controlled by a puppeteer, an external agent with intentions and goals, but you're a puppet with no puppeteer. The strings are being pulled by blind processes with no purpose or meaning. You're dancing, but no one's leading. You're speaking, but no one wrote the script. You're just matter in motion, complex enough to notice that it's being moved, but not complex enough to stop it. Ligotti uses this understanding to attack another consoling belief, that our suffering has meaning because it's the result of our choices. People often say that life is meaningful because we're free agents who create our own meaning through our choices. But if we're not really choosing, if we're just puppets of matter, then our suffering is meaningless too. We're just biological machines experiencing pain for no reason. Now we come to one of Ligotti's most disturbing ideas, that all of human culture is essentially a massive conspiracy to hide the truth about existence. Every religion, every philosophy, every system of meaning we've created is really just a mechanism to prevent us from seeing reality as it is. Think about the stories humans tell themselves. Almost every culture has some kind of creation myth that explains why we're here and what our purpose is. They tell us we're special, that existence is meaningful, that there's some kind of order or justice in the universe. But according to Ligotti, these are all comforting lies. Let's start with religion. The major religions all promise some kind of redemption or transcendence. Christianity says suffering is temporary and will be rewarded in heaven. Buddhism offers escape from suffering through enlightenment. Hinduism presents an endless cycle where you can eventually achieve liberation. Islam promises paradise for the faithful. What do all these stories have in common? They make suffering tolerable by promising it has a purpose or an end. They prevent people from confronting the possibility that suffering is just suffering, that it has no meaning, serves no purpose, and leads nowhere. Ligotti sees religion as the most obvious form of the conspiracy. It creates elaborate stories about cosmic purpose and divine plans to distract people from the fundamental horror of consciousness. It tells you that life is a test, a journey, a preparation for something better. Anything but what it actually is, a meaningless burden we never asked for. But it's not just religion. Secular philosophies do the same thing. Existentialism says you create your own meaning. Humanism says human flourishing is valuable in itself. Stoicism teaches you to accept fate with dignity. Every philosophy that claims life can be meaningful is participating in the conspiracy, even if unintentionally. Consider existentialism, which seems like it should align with Ligotti's pessimism. Existentialists acknowledge that life has no inherent meaning, but then they make a crucial move. They say you can create your own meaning through your choices and commitments. This sounds liberating, but Ligotti sees it as just another form of denial. Why? Because creating your own meaning is still a way of making existence tolerable. It's still a strategy for continuing to exist, rather than confronting the fundamental question of whether existence itself is desirable. It's saying, yes, life is meaningless, but we can paper over that meaninglessness with self-created purposes. The same is true for all the secular substitutes for religion. Career success, personal relationships, artistic achievement, scientific progress, social justice. These might be less obviously fictional than religious promises of heaven, but they're serving the same psychological function, giving people reasons to keep existing, preventing them from asking whether they should keep existing. Think about how society responds when someone questions whether life is worth living. We don't engage with the question seriously. Instead, we immediately assume something is wrong with the person asking. We diagnose them with depression. We put them in therapy. We give them medication. The question itself is treated as a symptom of illness, rather than a potentially valid philosophical inquiry. This is the conspiracy in action. Society cannot allow people to seriously question the value of existence because if too many people reached pessimistic conclusions, the whole social order might collapse. We need people to keep working, keep consuming, keep reproducing. We need them to believe life is worthwhile. So we create elaborate systems of meaning and purpose. We tell children that they can be anything they want to be, that their dreams matter, that life is precious. We celebrate birth and mourn death. We create art and literature that mostly affirm existence. We build monuments and institutions designed to last beyond our lifetimes, as if the continuation of human civilization is obviously good. But step back and look at this objectively. Why is it good that human civilization continues? Because it gives individual lives meaning. But those individual lives only need meaning because they exist. And we're questioning whether their existence is good in the first place. It's circular reasoning all the way down. Ligotti is particularly harsh on what he calls life-affirming art and philosophy. He sees works that celebrate existence, that find beauty or meaning in life, as propaganda for the conspiracy. They're emotional manipulation designed to make people want to keep living even though they have no good reason to do so. This includes most of the art and literature we're taught to revere, the great novels that explore the human condition, the poems that celebrate nature or love, the paintings that capture beauty. All of these are, from Ligotti's perspective, part of the machinery that keeps us trapped in existence. Even tragic art usually affirms existence in some way. Greek tragedies show how humans face fate with dignity. Shakespearean tragedies explore the depths of human emotion. Modern tragic novels often find meaning in suffering itself. They might show horrible things, but they're still suggesting that there's something noble or important about the human experience of suffering. Ligotti prefers what he calls supernatural horror, because it's one of the few genres that doesn't pretend existence is good. Horror fiction acknowledges that consciousness itself is terrifying, that being aware in an uncaring universe is fundamentally disturbing. It doesn't try to redeem this horror or find meaning in it, but even horror fiction is usually contained. The monster is defeated, or the protagonist escapes, or we close the book and return to normal life. True horror, for Ligotti, would be recognizing that there's no escape from the horror of consciousness itself. We are the monsters, trapped in our own awareness. Now consider how education systems work. We teach children science, literature, history, and philosophy, but we're very selective about what we teach. We present knowledge that's useful, that's constructive, that helps people function in society. We don't teach philosophical pessimism. We don't expose children to ideas that might make them question whether life is worth living. When pessimistic ideas are taught, they're usually presented as historical curiosities or as positions to be refuted. Schopenhauer is acknowledged but dismissed as too negative. Nihilism is explained but treated as something to be overcome. The idea that these thinkers might have been right, that life might truly be not worth living, is rarely seriously entertained. This isn't necessarily a conscious conspiracy. Most teachers genuinely believe they're helping students by teaching them how to succeed in life. But that's exactly the point. The whole system is structured to perpetuate existence, to give people tools for living, without ever seriously questioning whether living is good. The same is true of psychology and psychiatry. These fields are dedicated to mental health, which is defined as the ability to function well in society, to maintain relationships, to be productive, to experience appropriate emotions. Someone who questions the value of existence is considered unhealthy and in need of treatment. But what if questioning the value of existence is actually a sign of clear thinking? What if the healthy people are just better at self-deception? What if what we call mental health is really just successful participation in the conspiracy? Ligotti suggests that the truly horrifying thing isn't that some people are depressed or pessimistic. It's that most people aren't. Most people go through life without seriously questioning whether consciousness is good. They accept the social programming that tells them life is valuable and existence is worthwhile. They're successfully deceived by the conspiracy. Here's where Ligotti's philosophy becomes truly nightmarish. Even if you understand everything we've discussed so far, even if you see through all the illusions and recognize the conspiracy for what it is, you're still trapped. In fact, being aware of the trap might make things worse. This is what philosophers call the burden of consciousness, taken to its logical extreme. Most philosophical traditions that recognize life's difficulties offer some kind of solution or escape. Buddhism offers enlightenment. Stoicism offers acceptance. Existentialism offers self-created meaning. But Ligotti offers nothing. There is no escape, no solution, no redemption. Let's understand why. If you're reading this and finding these ideas persuasive, you might now see consciousness as the fundamental problem. You understand that existence is suffering, that meaning is illusory, that you're a puppet of biological processes you don't control. So what do you do with this knowledge? You can't unknow it. Once you've seen through the illusions that make life tolerable, you can't simply choose to believe them again. You're like someone who's learned how a magic trick works. The magic is gone, and you can't get it back. The consoling stories that work for most people won't work for you anymore. But you also can't stop existing without dying, and death brings its own problems. Humans have an overwhelming biological drive to avoid death. Even if you intellectually understand that non-existence would be preferable to existence, your body will fight desperately against death. Fear of death is hardwired into us at the most fundamental level. This creates what Ligotti sees as the ultimate torture. Being aware enough to recognize that consciousness is horrible, but not being able to escape from it. You're trapped in an existence you now understand to be meaningless and burdensome, forced to continue by biological imperatives you can't override. Moreover, society won't support your pessimism. If you express these ideas openly, people will be concerned about you, they'll suggest therapy, they'll try to cheer you up, they'll dismiss your conclusions as depression or negative thinking. You'll be isolated in your awareness. Most people are successfully participating in the conspiracy, successfully deceiving themselves into thinking life is worthwhile. They won't want to hear your pessimistic conclusions because those conclusions threaten their own carefully constructed systems of meaning. So you're trapped in multiple ways. You can't escape consciousness without dying. You can't make consciousness comfortable because you've seen through the illusions that normally make it tolerable. And you can't share your awareness with others because society treats pessimistic conclusions as symptoms of illness rather than potentially valid philosophical positions. Ligotti compares this to being the only person awake in a world of sleepwalkers. Everyone else is moving through life in a kind of dream state protected by their illusions. But you're awake, and being awake means seeing the nightmare clearly, and there's no way to go back to sleep. Think about what this means for daily life. You still have to eat, sleep, work, interact with others. You still have biological needs and social obligations, but now you're doing all of this while fully aware that it's meaningless, that you're just going through the motions because biological programming forces you to. This is what Ligotti calls living in bad faith with yourself. You know the truth, but you can't fully act on it. You continue to exist even though you recognize existence as a burden. You participate in social rituals even though you see them as part of the conspiracy. You're living a contradiction. Some people, when they reach this level of awareness, turn to various coping mechanisms. They might embrace a kind of philosophical pessimism as an identity, finding community with other pessimists. They might take comfort in the intellectual rigor of their position. They might feel superior to those who remain deceived. But Ligotti sees these responses as just more subtle forms of the conspiracy. Finding meaning in pessimism itself is still finding meaning. Taking intellectual satisfaction in seeing through illusions is still seeking satisfaction. Even gathering with other pessimists to discuss how horrible existence is creates a kind of community and purpose. There's no escape from the trap because consciousness itself is the trap. As long as you're aware, you're suffering the burden of awareness. The content of your thoughts doesn't really matter. Whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, religious or atheist, finding meaning or recognizing meaninglessness, you're still trapped in the fundamental horror of being a conscious being. This is why Ligotti is so uncompromising. He refuses to offer any consolation, any silver lining, any way to make the situation better. To do so would be to participate in the conspiracy himself. His role, as he sees it, is simply to state the truth as clearly as possible. Consciousness is horrible, existence is a burden, and there's no escape. Consider the various philosophical traditions that claim to offer liberation from suffering. Buddhism promises that through meditation and insight, you can achieve a state beyond suffering. But Ligotti would argue that this is just another illusion. As long as you exist as a conscious being, you're subject to the fundamental nature of consciousness, which is suffering. Even supposedly enlightened states are still states of consciousness. They might be different from ordinary consciousness, perhaps more peaceful or accepting, but they're still consciousness. You're still a self-aware being in a meaningless universe, still subject to biological processes you don't control, still trapped in existence. The same critique applies to philosophical positions like Stoicism, which teach acceptance of fate and inner tranquility. Yes, you might train yourself to be less disturbed by external events, less attached to outcomes, but you're still conscious, still aware, still existing. The fundamental problem hasn't been solved. You've just made it more bearable. And that's exactly what Ligotti objects to, making existence more bearable. Because making it bearable is how the conspiracy works. It's how consciousness perpetuates itself despite being horrible. If existence became truly unbearable for most people, humans would stop reproducing and consciousness would die out. But evolution has given us powerful mechanisms to make existence bearable enough to continue. We produce endorphins when we exercise. We feel love and connection with others. We experience satisfaction from accomplishment. We find beauty in nature and art. All of these make life tolerable enough that we keep going. From Ligotti's perspective, these mechanisms are not gifts, but traps. They are what keep us imprisoned in consciousness. Every moment of pleasure or satisfaction or peace is just the conspiracy doing its work, giving us just enough comfort to prevent us from seriously questioning whether we should continue existing. This creates a bizarre situation where the better your life is, in conventional terms, the more successfully you're trapped. If you're happy, if you find your life meaningful, if you have good relationships and satisfying work, you're less likely to question whether existence itself is good. The conspiracy works best on those it treats best. Meanwhile, those who suffer more, who have harder lives, who experience more pain, they might be closer to seeing the truth. But society intervenes. We treat their suffering as a problem to be fixed, not as potentially clear vision to be honoured. We try to make their lives better, to help them find meaning and purpose, to bring them back into the conspiracy. The trap of awareness, then, is complete. If you see through the illusions, you're trapped in that awareness with no escape. If you don't see through them, you're trapped in a different way, successfully deceived, but still suffering the fundamental burden of consciousness. Ligotti's philosophy offers no exit from this situation. There is no practice to follow, no insight to achieve, and no way of thinking that will free you. You're simply trapped, and becoming aware of the trap doesn't liberate you. It just makes you aware of how completely trapped you are. To understand Ligotti's philosophy, we need to go back to the 19th century and meet Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who laid the groundwork for philosophical pessimism in the Western tradition. Schopenhauer was the first major Western philosopher to openly declare that life is suffering and that non-existence would be preferable to existence. Most philosophers before Schopenhauer were optimists of one kind or another. They believed reason could improve the human condition, or that the universe had some kind of order or purpose, or that human life had inherent dignity and value. Even philosophers who acknowledged suffering usually found ways to redeem it or give it meaning. But Schopenhauer looked at existence directly and concluded that it was fundamentally terrible. He saw the world as driven by what he called the will, a blind, purposeless force that manifests in all living things as the drive to exist and reproduce. This will has no goal, no intelligence, no concern for the well-being of the creatures it animates. Think of it this way. Schopenhauer saw all of life as driven by irrational desire and want. A plant wants sunlight and water. An animal wants food and mates. A human wants countless things: pleasure, success, love, recognition, security, but these wants are never finally satisfied. Getting what you want just leads to wanting something else. This is what Schopenhauer called the pendulum of suffering. Life swings between pain and boredom. When you don't have what you want, you suffer from the pain of unfulfilled desire. When you get what you want, the satisfaction is brief and then you're bored or wanting something new. There's no state of lasting contentment because the will that drives you is insatiable. Schopenhauer was influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism, which he encountered through translations available in his time. He saw parallels between his idea of the will and the Buddhist concept of craving or attachment as the source of suffering. But while Buddhism offers a path to liberation, Schopenhauer was more pessimistic about whether escape was truly possible. For Schopenhauer, the tragedy of existence is that we're manifestations of this blind will, driven to pursue goals we didn't choose, suffering when we don't achieve them, and finding no lasting peace when we do. And unlike animals, which simply live out these patterns without reflecting on them, humans are cursed with consciousness that allows us to recognize our predicament. This is where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes particularly dark. He argued that increased consciousness means increased suffering. The more sophisticated your awareness, the more you're able to recognize the futility of existence, but also the more you're able to suffer in complex ways that simpler creatures cannot. An insect's suffering is limited to immediate physical pain or discomfort. It doesn't worry about the future or regret the past. It doesn't question the meaning of its existence. But humans can suffer in all these ways and more. We can suffer from anticipated pain, from remembered pain, from existential anxiety, from awareness of our own mortality. Schopenhauer concluded that it would have been better if nothing had ever existed. The world, as he saw it, is the worst of all possible worlds, not because it contains the maximum amount of evil, but because it's barely tolerable enough to continue existing. If it were any worse, consciousness would give up and extinction would follow. But it's just tolerable enough to perpetuate itself. He used a striking metaphor. Life is like a business that doesn't cover its costs. The suffering you experience always exceeds the pleasure or satisfaction. You're always operating at a loss, but you keep going anyway because the will drives you to continue regardless of whether it's worthwhile. This led Schopenhauer to one of his most controversial conclusions, that the best thing to do is to deny the will, to stop wanting, to withdraw from the world as much as possible. He saw asceticism and renunciation as the only rational responses to existence, not suicide, which he rejected because it's still an act of will, but a kind of a voluntary dying while alive. Ligotti draws heavily on Schopenhauer's ideas but takes them in a darker direction. While Schopenhauer thought denying the will might bring peace, Ligotti is sceptical that any such peace is possible. As long as you're conscious, you're trapped in the mechanics of consciousness, which includes suffering. Schopenhauer also believed that art and philosophy could provide temporary relief from suffering by allowing us to step back from the will and contemplate existence more objectively. In aesthetic experience, he thought, we could briefly transcend our individual wants and see things without the distortion of desire. But again, Ligotti is more pessimistic. Temporary relief is still temporary. You still have to return to ordinary consciousness, still have to face existence, still have to continue being a wanting, suffering creature. And even the appreciation of art or philosophy is itself a form of wanting. Wanting understanding, wanting beauty, wanting transcendence. What Ligotti takes from Schopenhauer is the fundamental insight that consciousness is structured to suffer. We're not suffering because of particular circumstances that could be changed, or because of ignorance that could be corrected, or because of social systems that could be reformed. We're suffering because consciousness itself, by its very nature, is a state of lack, of want, of unfulfilled and ultimately unfulfillable desire. Schopenhauer was dismissed in his own time as too pessimistic, too negative, too dark. Most philosophers and thinkers rejected his conclusions, preferring more optimistic philosophies that affirmed the value of existence. But Schopenhauer believed that this rejection was itself evidence that he was right. People couldn't face the truth about existence, so they clung to comforting illusions. He wrote that if you gathered all the suffering in the world at one time and truly confronted it, all the pain, all the fear, all the disappointment, all the grief, you would be horrified. But this suffering is spread out across space and time, distributed among billions of individuals, so we don't have to face its full weight. We only see our own suffering and that of those immediately around us. This allowed Schopenhauer to explain why most people don't reach pessimistic conclusions about existence. It's not that life really is good. It's that we're protected from seeing how bad it really is. We're insulated by a limited perspective, by the natural tendency to focus on our own lives, by social systems that normalize suffering and treat it as acceptable. Schopenhauer also pointed out that young people tend to be more optimistic than older people. Youth is full of hope, of anticipation, of belief that life will deliver on its promises. But as people age and accumulate experience, they often become more pessimistic. They've tried and failed, desired and been disappointed, hoped and been disillusioned. This wasn't just his philosophical position, it was reflected in his personality. Schopenhauer was notoriously gloomy, cynical and misanthropic. He lived alone, trusted few people, and saw the world as fundamentally hostile. Critics use this to dismiss his philosophy as just the rationalization of a bitter man. But Ligotti would argue this gets things backward. Maybe Schopenhauer's personality reflected his clear-sighted recognition of what existence really is. Maybe pessimism isn't a character flaw, but an appropriate response to reality. Maybe the cheerful optimists are the ones who need to explain themselves. One of Schopenhauer's most powerful arguments concerns reproduction. He asked, how can people justify bringing new beings into existence, given what existence entails? You're imposing consciousness, with all its suffering, on a being that never asked for it, and had no need of it. What gives you the right to do that? Most people never seriously consider this question. They have children because they only want them. Our Pige calls it expected because it seems natural. But Schopenhauer insisted we should think about it from the perspective of the child who will be brought into existence. What are we giving them? A life of wanting and suffering, of brief satisfaction followed by new wants, ending inevitably in decline and death. This line of thinking, developed further by contemporary philosophers, becomes what's called antinatalism, the position that it's wrong to bring new conscious beings into existence. We'll explore this more in later sections, but for now, it's important to see how Schopenhauer planted these seeds. Schopenhauer's influence extended beyond philosophy into art and literature. Composers like Wagner, writers like Tolstoy, and thinkers like Nietzsche all engaged deeply with his ideas. Even those who rejected his pessimism had to take it seriously. He couldn't be easily dismissed. Ligotti sees himself as continuing Schopenhauer's project but updating it with insights from modern science, particularly neuroscience and evolutionary biology. Where Schopenhauer spoke of the will in somewhat metaphysical terms, Ligotti can point to actual biological mechanisms that drive us. Where Schopenhauer relied on philosophical argument, Ligotti can cite empirical evidence. But the core insight remains Schopenhauer's, that consciousness is fundamentally a state of suffering, that existence is a burden rather than a gift, and that the only honest response is to acknowledge this rather than hide it behind comforting illusions. Schopenhauer wasn't alone in his dark vision, and neither is Ligotti. There's an entire tradition of philosophical pessimism that runs through Western thought, though it's rarely given centre stage in philosophy courses or public discourse. Let's explore some of the key figures in this tradition and see how they've developed the pessimistic insight. One of the most important 20th century pessimists was Emil Cioran, a Romanian philosopher who wrote primarily in French. Cioran took the pessimistic tradition and gave it a more existential, personal tone. Where Schopenhauer was systematic and argued from philosophical principles, Cioran wrote in fragments and aphorisms, capturing the lived experience of pessimism. Cioran's most famous work is The Trouble with Being Born, and the title itself captures his central insight. Being born, coming into existence, is the fundamental problem. Everything else that we suffer is just a consequence of this original catastrophe. If you had never been born, none of the pains and disappointments of life could touch you. What makes Cioran particularly powerful is his style. He writes with a kind of dark poetry, capturing the horror of consciousness in beautiful, memorable phrases. He doesn't argue you into pessimism. He shows you what it feels like to truly confront existence without illusions. Cioran was obsessed with insomnia, which he experienced severely. He saw sleeplessness as a metaphor for consciousness itself. When you can't sleep, you're trapped in awareness, forced to be conscious when your body desperately wants unconsciousness. This mirrors the larger human condition. We're trapped in consciousness when non-existence would be preferable. He wrote about how consciousness feels like exile from a peace we can never return to. Before birth, we didn't exist, and that non-existence was perfect in its completeness. Birth expelled us from that peace into the torment of awareness. Death will return us to non-existence, but only after we've suffered through consciousness. Another key figure is Peter Wessel Zapffe, a Norwegian philosopher who wrote an essay called The Last Messiah, that Ligotti frequently references. Zapfe's central idea is that human consciousness is an evolutionary mistake and overdevelopment that makes us unsuited for existence. Zapffe argued that we have too much consciousness for our own good. We're aware enough to recognize the meaninglessness and horror of existence, but we're still subject to biological drives that force us to continue. This creates an unbearable tension that humans can only manage through psychological mechanisms he called anchoring, isolation, distraction, and sublimation. Anchoring means fixing your attention on some value or meaning, career, family, nation, religion, and treating it as absolute, even though it's arbitrary. This gives you something to hold on to, preventing existential freefall. Isolation means repressing or ignoring thoughts that threaten your psychological stability. You simply don't think about death, meaninglessness, or the horror of existence. You keep these thoughts isolated from your everyday consciousness. Distraction means filling your time with activities that prevent reflection. Stay busy, stay entertained. Never give yourself time to truly think about your condition. Keep moving so the abyss doesn't catch up with you. Sublimation means channeling existential anxiety into art, religion, or philosophy. This is the most sophisticated mechanism, but Zapffe saw it as ultimately futile. Even great art or profound philosophy can't change the fundamental problem. They just transform it into something more aesthetically pleasing. Ligotti adopts Zapfe's framework almost entirely. He sees these mechanisms at work everywhere in human society. Every institution, every cultural practice, every social ritual is really just an elaborate form of distraction or anchoring, preventing people from confronting the horror of consciousness. Moving to more recent figures, we have the philosopher David Benatar, who has developed what's probably the most rigorous philosophical defense of pessimism in contemporary philosophy. Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, argues systematically that coming into existence is always a harm. Benatar's arguments are technical and careful. He doesn't rely on dramatic rhetoric or poetic language. Instead, he builds logical arguments showing that life necessarily contains more bad than good, that death is always a harm, that starting a life always imposes burdens that the non-existent don't bear. What makes Benatar particularly important is that he forces the optimists to defend their position rigorously. It's easy to dismiss pessimism as just negative thinking or depression, but Benatar's arguments require serious engagement. You can't just wave them away with platitudes about life being beautiful or meaningful. Benatar also developed what's called antinatalism, the view that it's morally wrong to have children. His arguments here are straightforward. You're bringing a being into existence who will inevitably suffer, who will die, who never needed or wanted to exist. You're imposing consciousness on someone without their consent for your own reasons. How can this be justified? Another voice in this tradition is the Norwegian philosopher and mountaineer Arne Næss. Wait, actually, that's wrong. Næss was an environmental philosopher and actually quite optimistic. Let me correct that. Another important voice is Philipp Mainlander, a 19th century German philosopher who took Schopenhauer's ideas even further. Mainlander argued that God committed suicide by creating the universe, fragmenting into the many beings that exist. All of existence is God's decomposing corpse, and everything that happens is part of God's dying process. All beings are driven toward death, toward the non-existence that God chose, toward the ultimate peace of annihilation. This is obviously a strange metaphysical story, and Ligotti doesn't adopt it literally, but he's drawn to the image of existence as a kind of cosmic death process, of consciousness as something that shouldn't exist and is slowly working toward its own extinction. These pessimistic philosophers share several common insights. First, that consciousness is fundamentally suffering. Second, that most systems of meaning are illusions designed to make this suffering tolerable. Third, that being born is a harm, not a benefit. And fourth, that there's no solution or redemption. Pessimism doesn't lead anywhere positive. What's striking is how consistently these thinkers have been marginalized. They are acknowledged in the history of philosophy, but rarely taken seriously. Their books are published, but not widely taught. Their ideas are mentioned, but quickly dismissed as too negative, too extreme, too depressing. Ligotti sees this marginalization as evidence that the conspiracy is working. Society can't allow pessimistic ideas to gain too much traction because they threaten the whole project of continuing existence. So pessimistic thinkers are tolerated as curiosities but never given a central place in intellectual discourse. Consider how philosophy is typically taught. Students learn about Plato's forms, Aristotle's ethics, Kant's categorical imperative, Mill's utilitarianism. These are all, in different ways, optimistic philosophies that assume human life has value and try to figure out how to live well. Schopenhauer might get a lecture or two, usually presented as an interesting but ultimately mistaken view. Curran is barely mentioned. Zapffe is almost unknown. Benatar is too recent and too disturbing to have made it into most curricula. The pessimistic tradition exists but remains hidden, like a dark undercurrent beneath mainstream philosophy. Yet these thinkers keep emerging in every generation. Despite the overwhelming pressure to be optimistic, despite all the social and psychological mechanisms that push people toward life affirmation, some individuals keep reaching the same pessimistic conclusions. They look at consciousness, at existence, at the human condition, and they see horror where others see meaning. Ligotti is one of these individuals. He came to pessimism through his own experience and reflection, but he found that others had been there before him. The pessimistic tradition gave him a vocabulary and a framework for articulating insights he'd already had. What unites all these thinkers is their refusal to look away from the horror of consciousness. They won't accept easy consolations. They won't pretend that meaning can be created where none exists. They won't participate in the conspiracy to make existence seem worthwhile, when it fundamentally isn't. Now we come to something that makes Ligotti unique among pessimistic philosophers. He's primarily known as a horror writer, not a philosopher. His fiction and his philosophy are deeply connected, and understanding this connection is crucial to understanding his worldview. For Ligotti, horror fiction isn't just entertainment, It's one of the few genres capable of expressing the truth about consciousness. Think about what horror fiction does. It takes the everyday world and reveals the terror lurking beneath it. It shows you that safety is an illusion, that the familiar can become strange and threatening, that there are forces beyond your control that can destroy you. In short, it makes you feel the precariousness and horror of existence. Most genres of fiction are essentially optimistic. Even tragedies usually affirm something: human dignity, the nobility of suffering, the importance of moral choices. Romance affirms love. Adventure affirms courage. Science fiction often affirms human progress. These genres participate in the conspiracy by suggesting that human life and experience are meaningful. But horror fiction at its best refuses this consolation. It shows you a universe that doesn't care about you, entities that are completely alien to human concerns, situations where reason and morality are useless. It makes you feel what philosophical pessimism argues, that consciousness is a trap and existence is horrible. Ligotti draws a distinction between different kinds of horror. There's what he calls supernatural horror and what he calls realistic horror. Supernatural horror involves ghosts, monsters, cosmic entities, things that don't exist in our mundane reality but represent deeper truths about existence. Realistic horror, on the other hand, depicts terrible things that actually happen. Serial killers, torture, war, disease. This kind of horror is disturbing but ultimately reassuring because it suggests that horror is something external, something that happens to you from outside, something you might avoid. Supernatural horror, according to Ligotti, can express something more fundamental, the horror of consciousness itself. The best supernatural horror makes you feel that existence itself is wrong, that being aware is itself terrifying, that consciousness is something that shouldn't exist. He's particularly drawn to writers like H.P. Lovecraft, whose cosmic horror depicts a universe where humanity is insignificant and consciousness is an accident in an uncaring cosmos. Lovecraft's characters often go mad from discovering truths about reality that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. Ligotti sees this madness as a kind of clarity. The characters who go insane in Lovecraft stories aren't weak or flawed, they're honest. They've seen reality as it is, without comforting illusions, and the horror of that vision destroys them. Their madness is the appropriate response to recognizing consciousness for what it is. In his own fiction, Ligotti creates characters who gradually realize that existence is horrible, that consciousness is a trap, that the world is fundamentally wrong. His stories don't have happy endings or resolutions. They end with characters trapped in nightmares they can't escape from, realizing truths they can't unlearn. One of his recurring themes is what he calls puppet horror, the disturbing feeling that you're not really in control, that something else is pulling your strings. We discussed earlier how humans are puppets of biological and psychological processes. Ligotti's fiction makes you feel this truth viscerally, not just understand it intellectually. His stories often feature characters who discover they're not who they thought they were, that their sense of being a unified self is an illusion, that they're actually fragments or constructs without any real essence. This reflects the philosophical position that the self is an illusion created by consciousness. Another common theme is the realization that ordinary reality is actually horrifying once you see it clearly. His characters might start in a normal world, but gradually they recognize that normality itself is the horror. The everyday world, seen without illusions, is more terrifying than any monster could be. This is what makes Ligotti's horror so disturbing. He's not saying there are terrible things lurking in shadows or hiding in basements. He's saying that the horror is in consciousness itself, in existence itself, in the basic fact of being aware. You can't escape it because you carry it with you everywhere. Consider the difference between this and conventional horror. In a typical horror movie, there's a monster or a killer, and the horror comes from the threat of death or suffering. But eventually the monster is defeated or escaped from, and the survivors return to normal life. The horror was external and temporary, but if consciousness itself is the horror, there's no escape. You can't defeat or escape from your own awareness. The nightmare isn't something happening to you, it's what you are. This makes Ligotti's horror more disturbing than conventional horror because it offers no possibility of relief. He argues that most horror fiction betrays itself by providing too much comfort. Even stories that seem dark often reaffirm meaning in subtle ways. The hero fights bravely. Love conquers fear. Good opposes evil. These narratives suggest that human values and meanings matter, even in a horror context. True horror, for Ligotti, would be horror that offers no meaning at all. Horror where courage doesn't help, where love doesn't redeem, where good and evil are equally meaningless. Horror that shows consciousness as a purposeless accident in an uncaring universe, with no narrative arc or redemption possible. His philosophical book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, can be read as an explanation of what his fiction has been expressing all along. The horror in his stories isn't just atmosphere or plot device, it's a vehicle for philosophical truth. The disturbing feeling his stories create is closer to reality than the comfortable feelings created by life-affirming fiction. Ligotti also discusses other art forms that he sees as expressing pessimistic truth. He's drawn to certain types of music, dark ambient, drone, noise, that create feelings of unease and dread without offering resolution or consolation. These sounds bypass the rational mind and make you feel the horror of existence directly. He appreciates visual artists who depict disturbing, nightmarish images that can't be easily interpreted or explained. Art that makes you uncomfortable, that refuses to be beautiful or meaningful in conventional ways, that simply presents horror without trying to redeem it or make sense of it. The key insight here is that some truths can't be fully captured in philosophical argument. You can explain rationally why consciousness is horrible, but you can't make someone feel that horror through argument alone. Art, particularly horror art, can create the emotional experience of recognizing consciousness as a nightmare. This is why Ligotti combines fiction and philosophy. The philosophy provides the framework and the arguments, but the fiction makes you feel the truth of those arguments. Together, they're more powerful than either would be alone. Many readers find Ligotti's fiction deeply disturbing, even traumatic. They describe feeling differently after reading his work, seeing the world in a darker way, having trouble shaking the feelings his stories create. Ligotti would probably see this as the highest compliment. His work is doing what it's supposed to do. It's breaking through the conspiracy, making people feel the horror that's usually hidden beneath comfortable illusions. Even if readers don't accept his philosophical conclusions, even if they reject pessimism intellectually, the emotional impact of his fiction lingers. They've felt, however briefly, what it's like to see consciousness as a nightmare. Of course, most people prefer fiction that doesn't do this. They want stories that entertain without disturbing, that provide excitement without genuine horror, that affirm their existence rather than calling it into question. And that's fine. That's the conspiracy working as it should, protecting people from truths they're not ready to face. But for those who are drawn to Ligotti's work, who find his fiction compelling rather than merely disturbing, something has shifted. They've glimpsed a truth that can't be unseen. They've felt the horror of consciousness directly, not just understood it as an abstract philosophical position. Now we reach one of the most controversial aspects of Ligotti's philosophy, his views on reproduction. If consciousness is a curse, if existence is suffering, if coming into being is a harm, then what does this mean for having children? Ligotti's answer is stark. Bringing new conscious beings into existence is wrong. This position is called antinatalism, and while it might sound extreme, it follows logically from the premises we've been exploring. Let's think through the reasoning carefully, because this is where many people's resistance to pessimism becomes strongest. Consider what happens when you have a child. You're creating a conscious being who will inevitably suffer. They'll experience pain, fear, disappointment, loss, and eventually death. They'll have needs that must constantly be met. They'll face challenges they never asked for. You're imposing all of this on someone without their consent. The standard response is that you're also giving them opportunities for joy, love, accomplishment, and meaning. Life has good things too, not just suffering. But remember the asymmetry argument we discussed earlier. If someone doesn't exist, they don't experience suffering. Which is good and this. They also don't experience pleasure. But that's not bad because there's no one being deprived. Think about it from the perspective of the potential child. Before conception, there is no child who is missing out on life's pleasures. There's just non-existence, which involves no deprivation. But once you bring that child into existence, you've created someone who will definitely suffer and might not consider their pleasure adequate compensation. Moreover, you can't get consent from someone who doesn't exist yet. You're making a decision that affects someone else profoundly without being able to ask them whether they want to take on the burden of consciousness. In any other context, imposing major burdens on someone without consent would be considered wrong. People often say they have children because they want them, because having a family is fulfilling, because they want to pass on their genes or values. But notice what all these reasons have in common. They're about the parent's desires, not the child's well-being. The child is being brought into existence to satisfy someone else's wants. If we accept that bringing children into the world is an imposition of suffering, we must ask why this practice remains the most celebrated aspect of human society. The answer lies in the architecture of denial, a term Ligotti uses to describe the cultural and psychological scaffolding that prevents us from seeing the harm we perpetrate. This denial is not merely a personal choice, it is an evolutionary requirement. A species that became collectively honest about the value of existence would be a species that ceased to function and eventually ceased to exist. Therefore, denial is woven into every level of our social structure. Consider the way we talk about the future. We speak of progress, betterment, and hope for the next generation. These concepts are the bricks and mortar of our denial. They suggest that suffering is a temporary problem to be solved by technology, politics, or social evolution. But as Ligotti argues, suffering is not a problem in life. It is the substance of life. Progress is merely the refinement of our distractions, the invention of more sophisticated ways to ignore the baseline discomfort of being conscious. We build better hospitals to delay the inevitable decay of our bodies, and more immersive entertainment to delay the inevitable recognition of our meaninglessness. This is not progress, it is an escalation of the conspiracy. The architecture of denial also manifests in our legal and moral codes. We have laws against harm and murder, yet we view the act of creating a new person who will inevitably experience harm and death as the highest moral good. This contradiction is hidden by the concept of the gift of life. By labeling existence as a gift, we bypass the need for consent. We convince ourselves that we are doing something for the child, when in reality we are serving the blind imperative of our genes. If we truly cared about avoiding the infliction of suffering, the most ethical choice would be to never bring a being into a world where suffering is the only guarantee. One of the most difficult concepts in Ligotti's philosophy is the idea of objective reality. For most of us, reality is a human-centric experience. We see the world through the lens of our values, our emotions, and our survival needs. But Ligotti asks us to consider what the universe looks like when those human filters are removed. This is the terror of the objective, the realization that the universe is not only indifferent to us, but that our self is a purely subjective fiction. Modern science often confirms this terrifying perspective. Biology tells us we are colonies of cells, chemistry tells us we are interactions of elements, physics tells us we are matter governed by indifferent laws. None of these disciplines find a soul, a self, or a purpose in the data. The you that feels important, that has hopes and dreams, is nowhere to be found in the objective description of the world. We are like characters in a book who have become self-aware enough to realize they are only ink on paper, but who still feel the pain of their fictional tragedies as if they were real. This objective view reveals that our suffering is malignantly useless. It serves no higher purpose. It is just the grinding of biological machinery. When a human experiences a crisis of meaning, it is essentially a mechanical failure of the brain's ability to maintain its subjective illusions. Most people flee from this objective view back into the safety of human narratives. They seek out religion, art, or community to re-establish the feeling that they are more than just meat that thinks. But the objective truth remains in the background, a silent horror that can be ignored but never truly erased. If consciousness is the problem, then why is it so difficult for us to share this realization? This brings us to the great isolation. As Ligotti notes, the pessimistic truth is the most isolating thought a human can have. Because society is built on the affirmation of life, the person who sees through the conspiracy becomes a social pariah. Even our closest friends and family will instinctively recoil from these ideas, not because they are false, but because they are toxic to the survival of the group. We are evolutionarily programmed to seek connection, but true connection requires a shared set of illusions. We bond over shared goals, shared loves, and shared meanings. When you stop believing in those meanings, you find yourself on the outside looking in. You become a spectator of the tragedy, unable to fully participate in the games that occupy everyone else. This isolation is a self-reinforcing mechanism of the conspiracy. It ensures that those who see the truth are kept quiet, either through social pressure or through the psychological weight of their own loneliness. Ligotti suggests that this isolation is why so many people choose the comforting lie over the unbearable truth. To be human is to belong, and to belong is to participate in the deception. To be a pessimist is to accept a permanent state of exile. You are forced to live among people who are celebrating a gift he recognizes a burden. You must watch as they impose this burden on new generations, and you must do so in silence, knowing that speaking up will only result in you being labelled as broken or ill. Much of our social and political life is based on the myth of the individual. We believe that we are unique, autonomous beings with inherent value, but Ligotti's philosophy, supported by the work of thinkers like Thomas Metzinger, argues that the self is a transparent hallucination. Your brain creates a model of a self to help the organism navigate the world, but there is no one actually inhabiting that model. We are ego tunnels, windows through which the universe looks at itself, but there is no us behind the window. This deconstruction of the individual is the ultimate blow to our sense of meaning. If there is no self, then who is suffering? If there is no individual, then what is the point of personal achievement or legacy? The conspiracy works by making us feel that our individual story matters. It gives us a name, a history, and a future to protect. But in reality, we are just temporary ripples in a sea of matter. The ripples will vanish, and the sea will remain, indifferent and unchanged. Ligotti uses the image of the mannequin, or the puppet, to illustrate this. A mannequin looks like a human, but is hollow. It has the appearance of life, but no essence. Ligotti argues that humans are essentially biological mannequins. We go through the motions of life, eating, sleeping, talking, but there is no spirit inside. We are machines made of meat, programmed to believe we are something more. Recognizing this hollowness is what leads to the profound sense of uncanny horror that permeates Ligotti's fiction and philosophy. As we approach the end of our exploration, we must confront the concept of the final intermission. This is the state of human life when the distractions no longer work. It is the moment between the failure of our illusions and the arrival of death. For some, this lasts for years. For others, it is a brief flash of clarity before the end. It is the realization that the show is over, and there was never anyone in the audience. Many people fear death because they fear losing their life, their meaning, and their self. But for the Ligottian pessimist, death is not a tragedy but a release. It is the end of the imposition, the closing of the ego tunnel. The real tragedy is not that we die, but that we were forced to live and be aware of it in the first place. Death is simply the return to the peace of non-existence that we should never have been disturbed from. It is the only solution to the problem of consciousness, though it is a solution that comes at the cost of the very being who needed it. However, Ligotti does not advocate for suicide as a general solution. Like Schopenhauer, he recognizes that the will to live is so strong that the act of taking one's life is often just another desperate, painful struggle within the trap. Instead, he advocates for a quietism, a withdrawal from the games of existence. This involves minimizing our participation in the conspiracy, refusing to reproduce, and waiting out the remaining time with as little delusion as possible. It is not a happy way to live, but it is an honest one. We conclude with the ultimate goal of Ligotti's philosophy, the voluntary extinction of the human race. If consciousness is a curse and being born is a harm, then the most compassionate thing we can do as a species is to stop, not through violence or mass death, but through the simple collective refusal to create more conscious beings. This is the conspiracy turned on its head, a conspiracy of honesty against the biological imperative. Imagine a world where the last generation of humans decides to be the last. They would live out their lives, care for one another, and allow the light of consciousness to slowly dim and go out. There would be no more children to suffer, no more ego tunnels to be haunted by the fear of death, no more puppets to be jerked around by the strings of evolution. The universe would return to its silent unconscious state, and the mistake of humanity would finally be corrected. It is a vision that most find horrifying, but for Ligotti, it is the only truly merciful conclusion to the human story. Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race does not ask for your agreement. It does not seek to convert you to a new belief system. It simply holds up a mirror to the mechanisms that keep you moving, and asks if you like what you see. You will likely leave this journey and return to your life, your goals, and your distractions. You will seek out comfort and meaning. But the mirror has been held up. The conspiracy has been named, and in the quiet moments of the night, when the distractions fail, you may find that the uncomfortable truth is still there, waiting for you.